In old Hollywood, fame came with rules. Some were written into contracts, some were whispered behind studio doors, and some were never spoken at all, because every actress was expected to understand them before she ever stepped in front of a camera. Be beautiful, but not too bold. Be charming, but not too honest. Be desirable, but never dangerous. By 1930, those rules had become even stricter. The film industry introduced the Motion Picture Production Code, better known as the Hays Code, a set of moral guidelines that decided what could and could not be shown on screen. Crime had to be punished. Desire had to be softened. Scandal had to be hidden. Hollywood wanted glamour, but it did not want truth. And behind the official rules, there were darker whispers, private warnings, quiet blacklists, names of actors and actresses who were considered too immoral, too reckless, or too troublesome for respectable studios. If your name became dangerous in Hollywood, your career could disappear without a public scandal. The phone simply stopped ringing, the roles vanished, the doors closed. For most actresses, this was terrifying. They protected their image like glass. They smiled at photographers, answered questions carefully, behaved at parties, and allowed the studios to polish them into something safe. But Tallulah Bankhead was not safe. She was not built for silence, and she was certainly not built for obedience. When Hollywood tried to shame her, she did not lower her eyes. When moral guardians judged her, she did not apologize. And when people called her scandalous, Tallulah seemed almost amused that they had taken so long to notice. She belonged to that rare kind of performer who did not simply enter a room. She seized it. Her voice was deep, smoky, and impossible to mistake. Her wit was sharp enough to cut through polite conversation. Her confidence seemed almost theatrical, even when she was standing nowhere near a stage. She called people darling, as if the word had been invented for her alone.
Hello, darling.
People were fascinated by her. Some adored her. Some feared her. Almost no one ignored her. Yet behind the laughter, the lovers, the parties, and the famous remarks, there was a darker story. Tallulah's life was not only the story of a woman who broke rules. It was the story of a woman who seemed to be running from silence, from grief, and from a loneliness that applause could soften, but never quite cure. Long before Hollywood whispered about her, Tallulah had been a little girl, born into a family that looked powerful from the outside, but was wounded almost from the beginning. She was born in Huntsville, Alabama, in 1902, into a respected Southern family. The Bankhead name carried weight. Her grandfather had served in Congress. Her father, William Bankhead, would later become Speaker of the House. It was the kind of family where reputation mattered, where public dignity was protected, and where a young woman was expected to understand her place. But Tallulah's life began with loss. Only 3 weeks after her birth, her mother died. Adelaide Bankhead had been admired for her beauty and charm, and her death devastated Tallulah's father. Grief swallowed him, and alcohol followed. Instead of becoming the steady presence his daughters needed, William became distant, wounded, and often absent. So Tallulah and her older sister were mostly raised by their grandparents. From the outside, it may have looked like a respectable childhood, but respectability does not always mean warmth. Tallulah grew up surrounded by family name, expectation, and emotional gaps no one seemed able to fill. Perhaps that was where the performance began. Perhaps that was where she first learned that attention could feel almost like love, and Tallulah knew how to get attention. As a child, she was dramatic in every sense of the word. If she was pleased, everyone knew it. If she was angry, No one escaped it. Her tantrums became family legend, loud, fierce, and exhausting. Her older sister was said to be so frightened by them that she would hide when Tallulah began to rage. There was already something enormous inside her. She did not ask to be noticed. She demanded it. Strangely, the adults around her sometimes encouraged the performance. Her father, returning from nights of drinking, would lift little Tallulah onto a dining room table and let her entertain his friends. She sang. She acted. She learned the power of holding a room before she fully understood the cost of needing one. That lesson stayed with her. If she performed, people watched. If she shocked them, they remembered. If she made them laugh, they forgave almost anything. School never managed to tame her. Her education moved through public schools, private schools, and boarding schools. But discipline could not hold her for long. Tallulah was restless, imaginative, and bored by the life others expected her to accept. She did not want to become a proper Southern young lady, polished and quiet, in the corner of someone else's drawing room. She wanted something larger. She wanted escape. Like many girls of her generation, Tallulah became enchanted by the silent screen. Those glowing black and white faces, those dramatic gestures, those women who seemed larger than life without speaking a word. But unlike most dreamers, Tallulah had the nerve to chase the fantasy. At 15, she submitted her photograph to a magazine contest that promised a chance at a screen test in New York. Whether by accident or instinct, her submission created curiosity. Her photograph was noticed. Her identity became a small mystery. And soon, the girl from Alabama was being sent to New York with a chaperone and a head full of ambition. It should have been the beginning of a film career. But fate had something more complicated in mind. Tallulah Bankhead was leaving behind the world of family expectation and Southern respectability. She was chasing the dream of becoming a star, not yet knowing that the camera would struggle to understand her, that Hollywood would one day fear her, and that the stage would recognize her first. Because Tallulah was not meant to be quietly admired. She was meant to be witnessed. And once she discovered the power of an audience, she would spend the rest of her life trying never to be alone again. Part 2. New York, Scandal, and the stage that found her. New York did not make Tallulah Bankhead quiet. It made her louder. She arrived as a teenage girl with a chaperone, a magazine contest victory, and the dangerous confidence of someone who had not yet been properly disappointed. She had come chasing the dream of motion pictures, the dream of seeing her face enlarged on a screen, her name printed beneath electric lights. Her childhood restlessness finally turned into something glamorous. But the screen did not open its arms to her. Tallulah found a few small chances in silent films, but nothing that truly claimed her. The camera noticed her beauty, certainly, but it did not yet know what to do with the force behind it. She was too vivid, too restless, too alive in a way that could not be flattened easily into silence. Film had been her dream, but the stage became her territory. On stage, Tallulah did not have to shrink herself. She could use the voice, the gestures, the reckless confidence that made adults stare and strangers remember her. She made her theatrical debut in New York and began finding work in plays that were not always successful. But even when the productions failed, she did not disappear inside them. That became one of the strange patterns of her career. The play could collapse. The critics could complain. The box office could suffer. But Tallulah remained interesting. There are performers who need a masterpiece to shine. Tallulah was not one of them. She could stand in weak material and still make people lean forward, as if something unpredictable might happen at any moment. Audiences did not simply watch her act. They waited for her to ignite. And offstage, she was already becoming a legend. New York in those years was full of people trying to be brilliant by dinner and infamous by midnight. Writers, actors, critics, Drinkers, social climbers, and professional wits crowded hotel lobbies and smoky rooms, turning conversation into a sport. Tallulah entered that world with the instinct of someone who had finally found a room noisy enough for her own spirit. At the Algonquin Hotel, she moved among sharp tongues and sharper reputations. It was a place where one clever sentence could travel across the city by morning, and Tallulah knew exactly how to make people repeat her words. She was young, daring, and almost alarmingly unafraid of judgment. The public saw the glamour. The private world saw the appetite. She drank. She experimented. She chased pleasure with the same hunger she brought to performance. Men were drawn to her confidence, women to her danger, and almost everyone to the feeling that life became less ordinary when Tallulah entered it. She did not behave like a girl carefully protecting her future. She behaved like a woman determined to spend her present before anyone could take it from her. But there was always more beneath the performance. Tallulah did not seem to know how to be still. Silence followed her like a threat. Loneliness pressed too closely. So she filled the hours with laughter, parties, flirtations, arguments, and applause. The noise became a kind of medicine, and like most medicines taken too often, it slowly became a need. In those early New York years, she also met one of the most important men of her life, Napier George Henry Sturt, a British aristocrat known as Napier Aylington. He was charming, titled, and deeply attached to her. For another woman, he might have represented security, marriage, and a respectable escape into high society. But Tallulah had not come this far to become someone's decorative wife. She liked admiration, but she did not like cages, even golden ones. Napier would remain important to her, and his devotion would follow her for years. Yet Tallulah's first loyalty was not to love. It was to the stage, to the spotlight, to the dangerous promise that she might become not merely admired, but unforgettable. Still, New York did not give her everything she wanted. For all the gossip she inspired, and all the attention she gathered, commercial success remained stubbornly out of reach. She worked, but she did not conquer. She performed, but she did not yet become essential. Her reputation grew faster than her career, and that was never a safe thing for an ambitious actress. Bills gathered, hotel tabs grew, patience wore thin. The world around her was amused by Tallulah Bankhead, but amusement did not always pay. By the time an offer came from London, it felt less like a career move and more like a door opening just before the room ran out of air. She was invited to appear in the West End, and Tallulah, restless as ever, crossed the Atlantic eagerly. London changed everything. If New York had introduced Tallulah to notoriety, London gave her grandeur. The British stage understood something about her that early film had missed. It understood that Tallulah was not meant to be reduced. She was meant to be unleashed. Her voice, low and smoky, filled theatres like a secret being confessed too loudly. Her movements were extravagant, sometimes excessive, but never dull. She could take a poor script and make audiences feel they had witnessed an event. Critics might argue about the play, but they could not ignore the woman at its centre. London society adored her. She moved through drawing rooms, theatres, parties, and scandals with the confidence of a visiting storm. She attracted aristocrats, artists, athletes, and men who believed they might be the one to settle her. They were usually mistaken. Tallulah enjoyed being desired, but she rarely confused desire with surrender. She bought herself a Bentley and drove it with more confidence than skill. When she got lost, which happened often, she did not panic. She simply paid taxi drivers to lead the way while she followed behind in her own car, turning confusion itself into a story people would later tell with delight. That was Tallulah's gift. Even inconvenience became theatre, but London also revealed the shadow beneath the sparkle. The applause was intoxicating, but it could not protect her from herself. When disappointment came, it came heavily. Rejection wounded her more deeply than her jokes suggested. At times, depression pulled her into dangerous places, and behind the famous laughter was a woman who could feel despair with frightening intensity. That contradiction made her fascinating. She could seem invincible in public and shattered in private. She could mock the world and still be wounded by it. She could fill a theatre with energy and return afterward to a room that felt unbearably empty. By the late 1920s, Tallulah Bankhead had become more than an actress. She had become a phenomenon, adored, whispered about, imitated, criticized, and desired. London had given her the applause she craved and the freedom she had always chased. But fame built on freedom can be dangerous, because the more Tallulah became herself, the harder it became for any studio, any critic, any lover, or any moral code to control her. And soon, Hollywood, the very place she had dreamed of as a girl, would try to turn that wild brilliance into something suitable for the screen. It would discover very quickly that Tallulah Bankhead could be admired. She could be desired. She could even be hired. But she could not be tamed. Part 3. Hollywood tries to tame her. Hollywood should have been Tallulah Bankhead's natural kingdom. It had beauty, money, gossip, power, and enough artificial moonlight to turn ordinary people into legends. It was a town built on performance, and Tallulah had been performing long before any studio placed her beneath its lamps. But almost from the beginning, something did not fit. On stage, Tallulah expanded. Her voice rolled across a theatre. Her gestures reached the balcony. Her presence could make even a weak line feel dangerous. But film was colder, closer, and less forgiving. The camera did not always reward size. Sometimes, it punished it. Tallulah had the face of a star, but her power was not quiet enough for the screen. She also hated the process. The waiting, the retakes, the marks on the floor. The same scene repeated under hot lights while men discussed angles and shadows. Tallulah needed the immediate electricity of an audience. The gasp, the laugh, the applause, the living proof that she had reached someone. Hollywood needed patience. Tallulah had appetite. By the early 1930s, she had appeared beside famous names, but the screen still refused to make her the great movie star she had once dreamed of becoming. She was admired more at dinner tables than in box office reports. At parties, she was irresistible. In studio offices, she was a risk. And risks were tolerated only when they obeyed. Tallulah did not. Her reputation moved through Hollywood faster than official publicity. Her parties became stories. Her love affairs became whispers. Her remarks became weapons, passed from mouth to mouth with delighted shock. In a town where actresses were trained to protect every inch of their image, Tallulah treated respectability like an old coat she had no intention of wearing. Then came the remark that made her impossible to ignore. In an interview, she spoke too openly about her private life, the kind of confession another actress would have denied, softened, or hidden behind nervous laughter. Hollywood's moral guardians saw exactly what they feared, a woman who could not be embarrassed into silence. For many actresses, scandal meant disaster. For Tallulah, it became part of the legend. She did not beg to be forgiven. She did not remake herself into something softer. Shame was a weapon that worked only on people willing to carry it, and Tallulah refused. But refusal had a price. The major studios stepped back. Serious film roles became harder to secure. The dream that had first pulled her from Alabama began to slip further away. Hollywood still invited her to dinner, still repeated her jokes, still enjoyed the danger of her presence. But it hesitated to trust her with its films. She was famous, but not safe. Wanted, but not dependable, celebrated, but not fully accepted. Then, in 1933, came a private disaster she could not laugh away completely. Tallulah was hospitalized with what the public was told was an abdominal tumor. The truth was more painful and far more scandalous. She was suffering from a severe infection that nearly killed her and forced doctors into emergency surgery. When she emerged, she was frighteningly thin, physically weakened, and permanently changed. For a woman whose legend had been built on appetite, confidence, and fearless sensuality, the operation wounded more than her body. It altered something private. It touched the part of her identity that had always seemed most defiant, most alive, most impossible to shame. But Tallulah did what Tallulah always did. She joked. She turned pain into theatre before anyone else could turn it into pity. And because the world laughed when she laughed, it often missed the damage beneath the performance. A few years later, she tried something that looked almost conventional. In 1937, she married actor John Emery at her father's home in Alabama. For a moment, one could imagine a different Tallulah, a wife, a settled woman, a famous name made respectable by marriage. But marriage could not contain what fame, scandal, illness, and society had already failed to control. The relationship faded. The restlessness returned. By 1941, the marriage was over, and Tallulah announced she would never marry again. It sounded like one of her famous jokes, but beneath it sat something colder. She was not made for cages, even tender ones. Around the same time, she faced one of the sharpest professional disappointments of her life. She wanted Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind, and in some ways, the part seemed made for her. A fierce Southern woman, selfish and wounded, charming and cruel, impossible to ignore. Tallulah understood that kind of woman. She had lived close to her all her life. Her screen test had force. But Hollywood refused her. She was considered too old, too difficult, perhaps simply too much herself. The role went elsewhere. A smaller part was offered. Tallulah turned it down. Pride would not let her stand beside the role she had wanted and pretend not to feel the loss. It could have ended as another humiliation. Instead, the stage gave her revenge. In The Little Foxes, Tallulah found a role large enough to meet her. As Regina Giddens, she did not have to be sweet, safe, or agreeable. She could be elegant, hungry, cold, cruel, and brilliant. For once, the material did not shrink beneath her force. It rose to meet her. Critics noticed. Audiences felt it. Beneath the scandals and the gossip, there stood a serious actress of extraordinary command. Then came The Skin of Our Teeth, another triumph, another reminder that Tallulah was never merely a personality. She was a performer with power, timing, and instinct. When the role was big enough to hold her. And in 1944, after years of disappointment on screen, film finally found the right shape for her. Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat placed her in a small, merciless world, a handful of survivors, a patch of sea, a floating stage with nowhere to hide. The setting was limited, but for Tallulah, that limitation became strength. Trapped in the frame, she could no longer overflow it. The camera had no choice but to study her. As journalist Constance Porter, she gave the screen what it had struggled to capture before: glamour, wit, toughness, fear, and vulnerability moving through the same woman. Hitchcock gave her a situation intense enough to contain her, and Tallulah answered with one of the finest performances of her career. The shoot was brutal. The water was cold. The conditions wore on her body, but the result was undeniable. For once, the screen caught the flame. Recognition followed, and Tallulah accepted it in the only way she knew how. Not humbly, not carefully, but with the grand certainty of a woman who knew she had finally been seen. By the mid-1940s, Tallulah had survived the blacklist, the operating table, a failed marriage, and Hollywood's refusal to understand her. She had been denied Scarlett O'Hara, then proved herself bigger than the rejection. She had lost parts, lost love, lost pieces of herself, and still walked back into the spotlight as if defeat were merely another bad review. But triumph did not calm her. It only gave the world another reason to keep watching, while Tallulah Bankhead continued burning from the inside. Part 4. The voice that would not stay quiet. Success gave Tallulah Bankhead another spotlight, but it did not make her easier to understand. By the mid-1940s, she had been dismissed, mocked, desired, punished, and finally praised. Hollywood had never known quite what to do with her, but the stage had proved what her admirers always suspected. Beneath the scandal was a serious actress, and beneath the jokes was a woman with force. Yet Tallulah was never only a performer. She was also political. That surprised people who preferred their actresses decorative, harmless, and grateful. Tallulah was none of those things. She had grown up in a political family, and politics had surrounded her from childhood. Her father's career had taught her the language of power, reputation, and public life. But Tallulah's own views were often bolder than the world she came from. She used her voice when silence would have been safer. During the years when many celebrities protected themselves by saying little, Tallulah spoke openly for causes she believed in. She supported theatre workers during hard times, defended civil rights, and lent her fame to people and issues that respectable society did not always want discussed. She was not a perfect advocate. Tallulah was full of contradictions. She could be generous and careless in the same breath. Progressive in public, yet still shaped by the privileges and blindness of her own background. She could speak bravely against injustice, then stumble into scandals that revealed how messy and imperfect her private life remained. But perfection was never the point with Tallulah. The point was that she spoke. She had never been good at silence, and sometimes that made her reckless. But sometimes it also made her courageous. In a world that rewarded actresses for being agreeable, Tallulah had the nerve to be difficult in public, not only for herself, but for causes larger than her own fame. And for a while, her career kept finding new doors. After Lifeboat, her screen work did not become what it might have been, but she remained a presence people wanted near them. Broadway still knew her value. Audiences still wanted that voice, that danger, that sense that anything could happen when Tallulah walked on stage. Then radio discovered her. In 1950, she began hosting The Big Show, a grand weekly program filled with stars, music, comedy, and conversation. It was an almost perfect medium for her. Radio did not need her to look young. It did not require the careful stillness of film. It needed personality, timing, confidence, and a voice people could recognize instantly. Tallulah had all of that. Her smoky drawl traveled through living rooms like perfume and smoke. She teased guests, commanded attention, and made radio feel glamorous again. Critics praised her. Listeners adored her. For a moment, it seemed she had found yet another way to survive. But even as she entertained the public, private restlessness remained. She hated being alone. That loneliness had followed her for years, sometimes hidden under parties, lovers, applause, and laughter. Now, as time moved forward and the wild young woman of London and Broadway became an older legend, the loneliness grew more visible. She struggled with sleep. Nights became difficult. Quiet rooms became unbearable. Tallulah had spent her life turning attention into medicine, but the dose never lasted. In 1952, her autobiography became a success, admired for its boldness and honesty. That, too, was very Tallulah. She had never been interested in appearing ordinary. If people wanted confessions, she gave them confessions. If they wanted scandal, she gave them scandal with style. Then came Las Vegas. A stage act at the Sands Hotel might have seemed like a step away from serious theatre, but Tallulah turned it into another triumph. The money was enormous. The crowds came. The one-woman show gave her exactly what she had always needed, a room full of people waiting for her to speak. But fame was changing around her. So was her body. The roles became stranger. The offers became less steady. Audiences increasingly wanted Tallulah more than they wanted the character she was playing. They came for the voice, the jokes, the legend, the outrageous woman they thought they knew. That kind of fame is flattering at first, then cruel. It traps a person inside their own image. In 1956, she took on Blanche Dubois in a streetcar named Desire, a role that seemed almost painfully close to her own mythology. Charm, ruin, performance, fear, and a woman clinging to illusion as the world grows colder. But the production stumbled. Audiences expected camp. Critics were not kind. Even those close to the play were disappointed at first. Tallulah, wounded but not defeated, worked to improve the performance, and later reactions softened. But by then, the damage was done. The show closed quickly. It was another reminder that talent alone could not protect her from time. Still, she could surprise people. Her famous television appearance with Lucille Ball showed exactly that. Rehearsals were a nightmare. She was late, difficult, unfocused, and alarming to those who had to work with her. People worried she would ruin the episode. Then the cameras came on. Tallulah delivered. That was the maddening thing about her. She could frighten everyone before the performance, then step into the light and become brilliant. The chaos around her was real, but so was the gift. And that gift kept people forgiving her long after they should have stopped. By now, however, the private cost was becoming harder to hide. Her drinking worsened. Pills entered the pattern. Sleeplessness, exhaustion, and dependency began to tighten around her. What had once looked like glamour and rebellion now carried something sadder. The parties were no longer only parties. The jokes were no longer only jokes. Tallulah was still adored, still quoted, still able to command a room with one smoky word. But the woman who had spent her life refusing to be controlled was slowly losing control of herself. And the tragedy was not that Tallulah Bankhead grew older. Everyone does. The tragedy was that the world kept asking for the legend, while the woman inside it was beginning to disappear. Part 5. The final curtain. By the time Tallulah Bankhead entered her later years, the legend was still alive. But the woman inside it was tired. She could still make people laugh. She could still command a room with that smoky voice and one perfectly timed remark. But behind the glamour, the damage was becoming harder to hide. The drinking had grown heavier. Pills had entered her routine. Sleep became difficult. And loneliness became something she could no longer outrun with parties, lovers, or applause. Tallulah had always hated being alone. For years, she had filled silence with noise. Theatre, scandal, laughter, interviews, friends, strangers, anything that kept the room from feeling empty. But fame has a cruel habit. It brings people close, yet does not always let them truly stay. As her body weakened, her image remained loud. People still wanted the Tallulah they remembered. Outrageous, fearless, wickedly funny, impossible to embarrass. But time had begun to take what Hollywood never could. Her health declined. Her breathing worsened. The voice that had once filled theatres with effortless power became rougher, more laboured, more fragile. Still, she kept appearing. Even when roles became smaller, even when the work became uneven, Tallulah refused to disappear quietly. She had spent her whole life walking into rooms as if she owned them, and age did not easily teach her how to retreat. But there were moments when the mask slipped. She knew she was changing. She could joke about it, of course. Tallulah could joke about almost anything. But beneath the humour was a woman watching her own legend turn into memory. The beauty, the power, the danger, the wild London nights, the Broadway triumphs, the Hollywood scandals, all of it seemed to belong to another woman now. And sometimes she said so. When people asked if she was Tallulah Bankhead, she answered with painful wit, "I'm what's left of her, darling." It was funny, and it was devastating. In May 1968, Tallulah made one of her final public appearances on The Tonight Show. She appeared alongside John Lennon and Paul McCartney, two young men from a newer world of fame. The moment was awkward, strange, and unforgettable. Tallulah was no longer the young storm who had shocked London and frightened Hollywood, but she still had flashes of that old electricity. Even diminished, she could not be ignored. A few months later, her body finally gave out. Tallulah Bankhead died in New York on December 12, 1968. She was 66 years old. Her final words were said to be simple, darkly comic, and perfectly Tallulah. Codeine? Bourbon. It sounded almost like a punchline. But her life had never been only a joke. Tallulah Bankhead had been reckless, brilliant, wounded, selfish, generous, exhausting, courageous, and unforgettable. She broke rules because she could not breathe inside them. She spoke when silence would have been safer. She loved dangerously, lived loudly, and turned even her disasters into theatre. Hollywood never truly knew what to do with her. The stage did. And history remembered her not because she was perfect, but because she was impossible to smooth into something ordinary. Tallulah once said, "Say anything about me, darling, as long as it isn't boring." And perhaps that was the only ending she would have accepted, because whatever else Tallulah Bankhead was, scandalous, tragic, fearless, or broken, she was never, not for one moment, boring.